So thanks everyone for joining us for the second of Gisha's two-part Gaza Policy Forum. I'm Tanya Harry, Gisha's Executive Director. As I shared last week, the goal of this policy forum is to bring together invested stakeholders to compile recommendations for promoting human rights and well-being in the Strip. Last week, we took a kind of bird's eye view of some of the practices and policies of regional actors vis-a-vis Gaza, focusing especially on the issue of Gaza's isolation and how that enables Israel's de facto annexation of the West Bank. So Abir El-Masri of Human Rights Watch joined us, and she shared what it was like to venture out of the Strip for the first time in her life and the obstacles she had to overcome to work with her colleagues in the West Bank in the before times, of course, before the pandemic. Dr. Yael Berda of Hebrew University and also Harvard University spoke about the repertoire of what she called the legal spatial measures that Israel employs to control the Palestinian population. And she urged us to take a look at the area as a whole with one sovereign, which is, of course, Israel. Dr. Natalie Tochi of IAI said that the international community needs to be shaken out of its inertia, and that specifically the EU has to maintain a human rights-based approach rather than seeing talk of rights as a kind of distraction from the pursuit of a solution to the conflict. So those were just some of the recommendations that our speakers last week made. A video recording of the panel will be made available soon for those who missed it. And we'll also be compiling the recommendations and publishing those. So today, we're going to be speaking with three individuals with perspectives on the humanitarian and economic situation in Palestine and in the Strip in particular. I'm very pleased to welcome our three panelists for today's session. Majd Masharawi is an entrepreneur from Gaza and the founder and CEO of Sunbox, a company that markets affordable solar kits for home use. Jamie McGoldrick is the UN Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and also Resident Humanitarian Coordinator. Badr Rock is the Legal and Economic Policy Advisor at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. So we're going to start the webinar with a moderated discussion with our panelists, which, as I said, it'll be recorded and publicized following the event, like the event last week. We're then going to open up the floor for an off-the-record discussion, which will not be recorded or publicized. Just to remind you, so on a webinar, the video function is disabled for all attendees, so don't look for yourself, you won't find yourself. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for a Q&A session later. You'll also be able to ask a question via audio in the Q&A section by raising your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please let us know via the chat function. So we're going to use Q&A for questions and chat for technical issues. So I actually want to start us off today with something that Dr. Berda spoke about last week. And she advised us, generally us, not to get mired in technical fixes, but rather keep an eye on the big picture. So of course, each of us, and I count Gisha in this, and saying each of us on this call, in our particular line of work, we're very much mired in the details. We're very much looking at technical fixes. We're looking at helping individuals on a day-to-day basis. At the same time, I think we all recognize that things cannot substantially improve until X. So X being whatever you believe according to your worldview to fill in that blank. Until the occupation ends, until there's reconciliation, until some kind of regional political transformation, good or bad, that things won't really change. So I know that Yael is at the same time not advising us to stop doing our work, but rather not lose sight of the big picture. So I'm hoping that we can, in this call today, hear from our speakers and our participants how they think we can best do that. On the one hand, not lose sight of the people on the ground, and on the other hand, take steps in our work towards more overarching, maybe one could say loftier goals, ensuring freedom, safety, equality. And especially at this time of surging needs on the ground, of competing crises, and certainly a crush on resources globally, I think these sorts of questions are more apt than ever. So I'd like to start off actually with Jamie. Jamie, I'd be glad if you could give us an overview of the situation on the ground at the moment with the outbreak of the pandemic, the economic repercussions of course, a double lockdown in Gaza coming on top of years of closure, military operations, the internal political risks. What kinds of challenges is the UN dealing with? And also, what kinds of challenges is it simply not placed to address? So to the speakers, again, please just go ahead and unmute yourselves when you're speaking. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, Tanya, look, thanks very much, and thanks for the offer to speak today. I'll give you an overview of the general situation, and then there was a couple of other questions I can come back to later. I mean, already the outbreak of the COVID-19, the situation in Gaza was obviously bleak and severe hardship. The years of blockade and, as you mentioned, isolation, the recurrent outbreaks of hostilities have taken away, undermined and eroded basic infrastructure, health service delivery and others, and the economy itself. The movement and restrictions imposed by Israel have severely undermined living conditions, and the recent escalations and the regular hostilities over the years have resulted in mass casualties, extensive destruction, obviously quite numbers of displaced people. At the outset of the COVID pandemic, Israel and West Bank in early March, both governments, the PA and Israel, worked quite well, quite effectively, I think, to coordinate the response to the actual COVID spread. However, I think since the Israeli announcement of its intention to annex parts of the West Bank, and then the subsequent decision by the PA to suspend coordination and refuse to accept the monthly transfer of clearance revenues, tax revenues, I think the situation has become increasingly more difficult. We've tried as a UN to act as a middleman, coordinating between the parties in the absence of direct communication between the PA and Israel. As a result, I think the UN has managed to ensure continued and the delivery of humanitarian and COVID-related assistance to the Palestinian people, both in Gaza and West Bank. We set up a logistics mechanism which works between both parties, and to date we've brought in about 80 plus consignments of health and other COVID-related material. And I think it's through that logistics cluster that we've been able to do that. And I think that we've only seen limited distribution in the supply of essential equipment and materials. There is a lot of stuff that's not getting put in as quickly as we'd like, and we're pushing for that. And as of last week, the UN in Gaza established the Gaza patient transfer mechanism through WHO. And that's been trying to establish that for some time. There's been complications over the Health Liaison Office being established in Gaza, and ultimately payments for that, but it seems to be working now. And I think that we've got to remind ourselves the UN is not going to replace the PA's functions and take over roles and responsibilities of the PA or Israel. Ensuring access to basic services, including healthcare, has been, it's the work of the occupying power and the authorities. The situation in Gaza, COVID-wise, and initially Gaza was quite spared from COVID for the first few months of the outbreak, and I think that was because of the lockdown. I think the occupation, I think the isolation worked in its favour, but I think the situation has changed quite significantly since the end of August. The local health authorities obviously saw that in the community for the first time, rather than just in the quarantine centres coming from people who arrived from Rafah. And I think this discovery was made at a time when the escalation between Gaza and Israel had intensified, and it resulted at that time in the closure of Kerem Shalom, as well as, more importantly, I think, the suspension of operations at the Gaza power plant, and ultimately the closing of the fishing zone. And I think the development of all of that, and the combination of all of those factors, I think shows and just demonstrates quite clearly the precarious nature of how vulnerable the situation in Gaza is when hostilities erupt. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, and make life really difficult for everybody who lives there. As of yesterday, the total number of COVID cases in Gaza is now almost 1,600, and 15 people have lost their lives. The Gaza Minister of Health reported 88 new infections on Saturday and another 100 yesterday, Sunday. And while the outbreak appears to be concentrated in certain parts of Gaza, it's difficult to know how widespread the virus is at this point, because the testing, we do about 1,500 a day. Obviously, a population of that size, obviously the crowded conditions, all of that, the sanitary issues, and the general poverty that's there, one doesn't know. But I would say that the young population probably offsets that. There's a lot of asymptomatic COVID-19 out there. I think local health authorities continue to take samples and have developed new protocols and policies for that to try and deal with the outbreak in the community. And in addition, they've put quite stringent at times movement restrictions across different parts of Gaza at different types to prevent that cross-governorate move. And I think that's good. The UN continues to support all the parties to address the COVID outbreak. And we're trying to put together a standard allocation of about $17 million. That's been launched now to try and get some project ideas from local NGOs and international NGOs and UN agencies on the ground there to try and address that. We have a COVID response plan, and we've already allocated some $12 million to Gaza, covering health, water, sanitation, etc. So we're looking to try and strengthen the ability for the Gaza Strip to absorb the actual mild right through to critical cases. In that regard, we've got a pipeline of quite a good pipeline of ventilators and intensive care unit supports into the hospitals at 160, and that will add to the already 100 plus that's there. So that's us. But I mean, we're just reflecting on COVID at a time when we have to look at Gaza and the socioeconomic situation. It's under great distress, and it has been for decades. And the crisis is multifaceted, including massive unemployment, the demand side contractions, power, the ability of people purchasing power is limited, and collapse in incomes and revenue, the liquidity crunch, the severe non-market bottlenecks in foreign trade, the export-import, all of it is so fragile and can be turned on and off. And the provision of basic services in Gaza, particularly electricity and water, remains totally insufficient for a population of 2 million. And without interrupted access to electricity, healthcare providers, water infrastructure, supply, businesses, they're unable to operate. And we spoke to the business community there some weeks ago, and we heard from them the impact that was having directly on their ability to produce, to operate. And we try to, as the UN, advocate for improved services, for reliable electricity, continued fuel supply from Qatar to the Gaza power plant, to bring that in on a basis. And at the same time, trying to increase the amount of solar power we have there to take more and more institutions off the grid. And I know that we've got a colleague here, Majid, who does that for home base. So we're trying to ensure the steady supply would allow water, the water infrastructures, wastewater facilities to operate properly. Because what you'll get is when the winter comes and flooding happens and all of these things contamination takes place. We also have to help business owners and Gaza industries to create employment, not just short-term cash for work employment, but proper substantive. And we have to generate revenue and family money so that they can live a dignified life. And this, I think, we need to try and find ways of getting money into the community so people can pay for the services they get. I think that in the past, the high levels of international assistance have prevented the collapse of basic services, and it's reduced the humanitarian vulnerabilities. I think but I would highlight the services provided by UNRWA for 1.3 million people. And this has been essential, I think, to ensure relatively high levels of basic healthcare and minimum standards of education in Gaza, and much better than some of the regions. However, I think the unprecedented low levels of international funding we now see, and that's been since the start of the US cuts, but others as well, we see now that these safety nets have been threatened. And I think these have kept Gaza in a resilience mode or afloat for many years. And since just looking at the COVID outbreak and the suspension of coordination between Israel and Palestine, our role as the UN is trying to be focused on ensuring this ongoing continued delivery of essential services in the West Bank and Gaza. And, these, as I mentioned, some of the mechanisms, I think that we're not able to expand our role any further. We're here to do humanitarian development work. Taking on more functions of the PA or Israel is not something we've banked on, and we don't have the funding for that. So I think that what we're looking for is for the COVID crisis, and the UN has been trying to advocate for the parties to re-engage, for the PA to accept the clearance revenues and the transfers, and for Israel to ease the restrictions, especially on Gaza. And more generally, the UN and internationals have managed to facilitate quite a large degree of reconstruction since 2014 and preserve some calm there. Nikolai's often, on the phone, pushing the parties in the Security Council, trying to make sure that it doesn't tip over into that edge. And that we come close very many times. We ring the alarm bell many times as well. And so far, we've come back from the brink. I think in the longer term, political change is necessary for the developments in Gaza. Reconciliation, the return of the PA are important building blocks for that. If any change is going to be possible. real re-engagement with the parties on the final status issue looks very far from where we are right now, but remain the only way forward to get some just and lasting solution to this conflict. So I would just say, maybe in closing, in the short and medium term, it's critical that the work we do, it works on several fronts at the same time, several dimensions as well. As a priority, we must ensure sufficient support to the humanitarian assistance on the ground, and that means UNRWA and everyone else. I mean, 12 years ago, there was 100,000 people receiving food aid. Now there's 1 million. We haven't put in place sustainable development. We haven't put in development. We haven't put in anything that's dignified. What we've done is left people in a very, very fragile situation, and they're hanging on with a thread. And this is unacceptable in a modern-like world, in a first world setting. And I think the second thing we must do is to make sure we can do is that UNRWA must continue to provide its critical service to the population. And we must look for immediate measures aimed at bolstering Gaza's infrastructure so the energy and the water and the health systems remain functioning intact for a population which is burgeoning, is growing by the day, literally. And finally, I think support to Gaza's economy with programs aimed at creating jobs, real jobs, and reviving Gaza's industrial sectors is the only way we're going to take them forward here. People cannot rely on fragile funding from this funding stream that comes from humanitarian, which is very politicized, as we know in this context. And the absence of progress on all these fronts will be facing an increasingly complicated humanitarian and human rights crisis with fewer means, I think, in the future to address it properly. So, I mean, I'll stop there, and the other two questions you gave me, I can answer later if you wish. Thanks.
I am actually really curious about your answer to the question I gave. So for those who aren't aware, Jamie is on his way out, right? I believe at the end of this month or soon.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, in light of the things that you have talked about. I mean, we're maybe not everyone, but we're aware of the complicated nature. And I'm sort of curious about your own position in this. I mean, do you have hindsight now on your own position about maybe something you would do differently, or advice you would give to your successor in light of what you mentioned? I mean, I think especially in light of the fact that what you're saying, I very much identify with this idea that Gaza is hanging by a thread. In Israel, there's a false perception that Palestinians get so much aid and nothing goes anywhere. But of course, we know what the reality is, which is that people are sort of running in place, just keeping their heads above water. So I'm curious.
I mean, maybe just a few comments. I mean, I you asked also about other places I've worked. I don't think I like to compare and contrast crises. I think they're all standalones. But maybe to say that the humanitarian crisis anywhere in the world, especially in this region, has become more politically charged than ever before, especially in this region. I think more and more humanitarian discussions is taking place in places like the Security Council in absence of political dialogue. I think that humanitarian issues and the content end up being ballast or styrofoam for packaging of political discussions that are not taking place. Political leaders are spending their time discussing these issues when they should be discussing how to fix a problem. And I just think Palestine is the longest standing humanitarian or politicized humanitarian crisis in the world. And I think the recent moves on normalization, as well as the increased threat of annexation, takes the political dimensions of crisis here to, I think, a different level, even, or a different angle, I would say. And if the Israeli and Palestinian conflict is one of the most, I think, intractable of our time, the humanitarian situation it's produced over many years is certainly one of the most complex and the most protracted and entrenched. And I think working here and for my successor in such a polarized and visceral environment, the line between addressing the long-term humanitarian consequences of conflict, in this case, the cumulative effect of decades of occupation and blockade, and being seen and stand in judgment over its causes can quickly become blurred. And I think that we, as a humanitarian or as humanitarian organizations, cannot afford to stray across the line into the domain of political people and peacemakers, or at least if they want to be accepted across the board with an approach that's accepted, credible and relevant. I think there's one false step, as we all know, in this minefield, be it an action, be it words, can set off charges of bias, of politicization, of prejudice, and ultimately, I think, stymie humanitarian access to people in urgent need of protection and assistance, whatever of the front line they may be on. And I think this is true in armed conflict throughout the world in places I've worked before. Although in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, where the perspectives of national identity and history and politics and human suffering have become so intertwined. As a result, I think the path of neutrality has been as delicate as it's been crucial. And yet, I think the neutrality, the independence and the impartiality, the things we stand by as humanitarians, risk becoming an empty mantra unless we can put humanitarian response in place, which is seen to be effective and leads to something which is much more dignified in the longer term. And I think that's something we have not been able to do. And the words of advice I would give to my successor is that, I remember Edward Said said in 1993 Reith lectures when he said there, we mustn't turn away from difficult principle positions. You know, when you know you've got, that's the right one. But if you don't decide to take that because you don't want to appear too political, or you're afraid of seeming controversial, you want to keep your reputation balanced or impartial, you cannot turn away from that. You've got to accept that. So you've got to be brave, but you've got to be smart and strategic. Otherwise, you'll get clamped on by here. I think it's difficult to predict what the COVID-19 will bring on the world order for Palestine. But I think whatever we believe in that post-COVID world, I think it's shaped by what we do right now, our present response, the willingness for us to act together. I think regional actors, political actors, I think global actors, and I think the local actors, we've got to get a better message out there, a better narrative to counter this very negative. You mentioned the propaganda about too much aid going in there. We know that's not true. We see that every day. But we have to do something to create an impression of a life with dignity. And I think that we must have renewed efforts for dialogue for all the parties, because this lack of reconciliation in the Palestinian leadership is not helping their cause to bring about a better result. And then ultimately, my own advice to my successor would be, spend your time finding solutions. Stop this excuses why it can't be done. And then my Nelson Mandela paraphrasing is also, it's always impossible until it's done.
Yeah.
And that's why I would go. Yeah. So.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for that, Jamie. And I'm sure people will maybe circle back to some of the things that you said in the Q&A. I want to turn to Maj now, if that's okay. Maj, thanks so much for joining us. I think that the audience of this call is kind of diplomats and fellow civil society organizations. So I'd be glad if you could actually introduce yourself to those who don't know you maybe, and if you can share a bit about the initiatives you've developed, how you got started, et cetera, that'd be great. So thanks.
Thank you so much for having me part of this webinar. I'm so glad, and I can see that some of our network joined this webinar. So I'm so glad that some people wanted to hear our voice, although there is a lot of things happening in Gaza and outside Gaza as well. My name is Majd, and I'm from Palestine, Gaza. I was born here, I grew up here. And since I was a kid, Tanya, I had a vision of having a country. And that was my dream, and it's still my dream. Although I grew up in a place that lacks the basic needs for any human being. And till 2017, since I was born in 1993 till 2017, I felt that it's fine. Like, it's fine to be like this. You just have to adapt yourself and live around these circumstances. But when I left Gaza for the first time, 2017, that was my first time to say no. This should not happen to us. This should not happen to me. And this should not happen to my people. And before that, I launched my first company when I was at college, where I studied civil engineering. And the sense of business came from the fact that I wanted to be independent. So if I am independent, I can control my own decisions. I can decide, I can build, no one can control me. Although I grew up in a place where everything around me is blocked, like being a woman, growing up in a society like Gaza that's closed for almost 13 years now, means that you have two blockades. You have the society blockade and you have the Israeli blockade. But that's why I felt I should be powerful and I should be impactful and I should influence other women and have one day, hopefully, a platform or a place where everyone can speak up and our voices can be heard. So in 2015, I launched my first company, which was a result of me going through different wars living by the north side of Gaza, where our house was partially destroyed in 2008 and 2012. The company was producing building blocks from the rubble and ashes of the demolished houses. And I had no idea that this is going to be a business one day. I just wanted to prove two things. One thing is we can create something from nothing, although we lacked so many resources, and we have less than the 10th of the resources that any young people around the world, especially in the Western and the US communities have. And the second thing, that women are capable to do things exactly like men or even more. And I knew that the world won't hear what I want to say or my vision unless I have something to show them, unless I have something recognized. So in 2017, I left Gaza for the first time, and I had the vision. So I had this vision, and it became wider. And in 2017, after I joined a fellowship in the States, I launched my second company, which is Sandbox. And the reason of launching Sandbox was a suffering that I've been through with the green bricks. So I remember myself in 2015, 2016, going to the factory to produce the bricks 3 a.m. in the morning. Okay. And again, I felt it's normal. I have to live around it. It's fine. I just need to produce the bricks, focus on the results. And when I went outside and I saw the streets have lights during the night, when I studied during the fellowship in the college, I just charged my phone whenever I want to. I charged my laptop whenever I want to. And I asked myself why I don't have this privilege inside Gaza. So we decided to launch a solar company called Sandbox, and Sandbox mainly targets the unprivileged communities in the Middle East, starting with the Gaza market, the most needy market. And we wanted to have it as a for-profit business with a social impact. And when we started the company in 2017, I went back to Gaza, and I remember calling Gisha, being stuck in the border, waiting for 12, 15 hours. And unless I crossed back, I went back home, we launched the company, and we started with providing small solar equipment. And once we started working in the market, that was the shock, that the market doesn't have money to pay for the devices. So people in Gaza, they are in need for so many things, but they cannot afford it. And if we look closer, we could see that 1-2%, 5% of the people can have a solar system, but more than 90% cannot afford it. And that was the challenge of how can we make this business running, creating development jobs, and at the same time sustainable. So in the beginning, we've spent so much money on providing subsidized systems, and we've raised investments from recognized investors. One of them is in the meeting today, so I'm so glad she joined. And we've raised as well donations through crowdfunding, and we started providing systems with subsidies. So one solar system would cost a family maximum $350, which is something that even the government here did not believe. It was like, how could you provide affordable solar systems? And this system was shared with more than a family. So we were looking for families in Gaza who live together. For example, 2-3 families could share one device and split even the $350 so they can afford it. Now we've been operating for almost 3 years. And we've become sustainable officially by the end of last year, early this year. We've lost, again, so much money, but I don't consider losing money more than creating the impact. We've provided around 10,000 people with electricity, another 8,000 to 9,000 with water. So we've worked on the household level. We did solar systems for desalination plants. And we worked in the health sector, providing hospitals, health clinics with solar systems. We also did education. So we launched recently an online classroom that teaches solar basics for free for our fresh graduates in Gaza. And we've been recognized in many different platforms around the world. So we got awards. We managed to make the team travel for the first time. And these are young people who had the same vision like the one I had in 2017, and to show them how the world looks like. And today we are in the phase of scaling up. So we are looking for the next market that we wanted to penetrate. We are finalizing our documents, registration, and yeah, there are other things to say, but this is just in general. But by the end of, I wouldn't say the end, by today, which is after almost 5 years of working in the entrepreneurship ecosystem and the entrepreneurship sector in Gaza, it's there's no economy. Like I would be sarcastic if I could say, yes, we are supporting the economy is supporting us. Like we consider a country, when do we, and that's a question I asked myself this year. I was like, when do we consider a country if it has an economy or if it doesn't have an economy? And an economy means free trading. So I remember many times our products were stuck in the border for months, and the border was just closed because of the Great March of Return and the bombs back and forth. I remember we've brought batteries that was out of date because it was stuck. I remember not being able to issue some permits for some products because they're just dual use. And I remember selling products with almost cheaper than what costed us because people cannot afford paying for it because there is no salaries. So this is not a regular economy, and we don't consider Sandbox in the market as any other company around the world. No, because we've been operating under different circumstances, and we've been trying to do the things, the impact, not only the return, and it has been difficult. It has been so difficult because it's not like one government is controlling your life. You have 3 governments, and add to that Egypt and Jordan. And yeah, so when you have to find a common ground between every stakeholder and just try to get everyone on your side by not making the other side upset. And that was the challenge, how to, to satisfy, for example, an X and not upset Y during your work. Add to that the social pressure. And as a small company trying to show that it's possible to do different things, we faced some, we faced a lot of difficulties from the local government. And that was like, they were saying, what you are trying to do? Why do you do this? Like, we don't understand. We don't believe that young people can do such a thing. Someone like you should go back home and get married. Like, why do you do this? And now you are gathering young people around you. This is not normal. This kind of support. And when I needed a support buddy, I went to the United Nations office, and they said, all what we can offer you is recognition. So we can write about your case, thanks to them, but we can't protect you. So, okay, you can write about my case, for example, and you can write about what we do, but at the same time, what happens if, for example, the government comes and say, we will arrest you, okay? Because you've been talking badly about us. Or what could happen if someone says, Majd has been interrogated at Erez border, so I can write about this. So Israel would say, no permit again. So there is no guarantee, there is no protection for young people who are trying to do something different or creating development projects on the ground. Part of, away from Sandbox and Green Cake, we've initiated several initiatives. One of them is now we are working on creating a women's summit in Gaza, which will be a first platform for women entrepreneurs working on the tech, energy, water sector. And also we've created a gym for young people under 16 years old to practice the parkour sport. We've sponsored several events in Gaza where we can find university students presenting ideas, startups ideas, and we bring investors from inside Gaza itself. So the business people who might be interested, for example, in agricultural projects and environmental projects. And yeah, it has been a long journey, but we are on it.
Thank you, Majd. I really appreciated a lot of what you had to say. This issue of there not being an economy, I think, is really important. Often here at Gisha, we're dealing with terminology and how we talk about the situation. And I say, if anything, we can talk about economic activity, but not necessarily development. And that's the sad reality. You've talked about a lot of the challenges that you've faced, and I know that Gisha has accompanied you in some of those, maybe not successfully every time, but we're certainly following the great work that you're doing. I'm curious, and I'm sure people listening to you are curious, how you maintain a spirit like you do to keep going. And was really glad to have you on the call, because I think, you know, more than any of us, you know, you're representing the future of Gaza as a young person, as an entrepreneur, and I'd be glad if you could share in just a few minutes, because we're low on time, you know, what your advice would be to other young people who are getting started.
Well,
and maybe to all of us who lose hope at times, I should say. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, Tanya. Well, my first advice is never give up. So it's easy to give up, but it's easier to, from my own point of view, it's easier to see the light by the end of the journey. You just need to go through so many obstacles and problems. The second advice is to surround yourself with the ones who support you. You have to be smart who to be with, who to get the advice from, and which books to read and which people to talk to. Like, never waste your time, and always you should always be focused. It's really hard to be focused in such an environment, but sometimes, you know, well, like, I'm so glad that I have so many, not so many, I have good people in my life who always supports my decision, believes in my vision, and helps me to scale up what I'm doing, plus support my leadership. So once, you know, I always consult with them, ask them for advice, what should I do, what I shouldn't. The third thing, which is the most important thing, is to know exactly what your community needs. Okay, so I've never listened to people who could say, oh, we need this, we need this. I'm always close to the people. Like, even during our solar installations, Tanya, sometimes I don't go to the site, but when I go to the site, I don't go for the technical aspect. I go for the community aspect, to hear from the people what they need, what they lack. And when I was a kid, I was very active in the community. So I entered literally every single house inside the camps in Gaza. So I know exactly what does it mean to live without clean water, without electricity. How does it feel when you don't have a slab on the top of your head? And my fourth advice is to create access to the outside world. It's so difficult. It's honestly, you don't know how the world looks like unless you go outside. Films, movies, all of these things are useless. The last time I watched a movie was like 3 years ago, because it made me very upset. Yeah, so you should always find the access, and the access should come through talking to people outside, joining platforms, and also reading. Like, reading would really give you a wider vision of how the world looks like. One last advice is to try. You should always try different things. So when I started my journey, I was not sure of what exactly I wanted to be, because no one taught me before how the future looks like. We always think of today in Gaza. We don't have the vision of thinking of tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, because we can't. Like, we don't see today. How can I see tomorrow? By trying different things, and that's an advice I always give for the entrepreneurs. They come and say, we don't know, what should we do? And I say, so do what you can. Do whatever you can now. Try different ways, unless you find your passion, and then go ahead. And there's like a very important advice for the women. In Gaza, we have a problem between mixing concepts. So people think, for example, if you're a housewife, you can do such a thing. If you are not educated, you can do 1, 2, 3, 4. I've seen women coming from Bedouin villages in Gaza. Imagine, Bedouin villages outside Gaza is complicated. What about Bedouin villages inside Gaza? And they have been so successful. Like, these women should be featured, should be taken as role models, and that's what we lack. Like, when I grow up, I was looking for someone from my community, not in the States, okay, not in Europe, not in the Arab world. I was looking for a woman from Gaza who's doing something different, so I can consult with her. I was seeking for a mentorship from someone from my community. So we should build role models. We should build people who can be as a reference for other people who are just starting their life. But unfortunately, no one is building this. And this is one essential part of any infrastructure of a community, where you can find people like Jamie just mentioned about Nelson Mandela. Okay, so it means that he was influenced by him. I was influenced by Muhammad Ali a lot, and I was reading his, books and reading this and this. So we need someone who's close to our culture. So when we do anything, we would feel that it's okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. That was really uplifting for me personally, and again, I am sure that people will have questions for you. So turning now to Badr, and maybe going back a bit to the kind of out of the economic world and back into the humanitarian and the aid world. I want to talk to you about projects. So projects is something that, comes up often in discussions about the Strip. People, diplomats, others are looking for what can be transformative. Is it the seaport? Is it building an airport? And the counter argument that we make at Gisha is certainly that these projects are important. They could really open Gaza up for the access that it needs. On the other hand, that they could serve as an excuse to further undermine the connection between the West Bank and Gaza, and to kind of continue to isolate the Strip. So I'm wondering what your perspective is, and I've heard that you have an interesting perspective on this. Do you think that these projects should progress despite the political deadlock in the region, despite reconciliation not going forward, or do you think that they should be put on hold until there is some kind of progress? So that's a kind of general question to start with.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for inviting me to speak. So first of all, I'd like to thank Jamie and Majd for the interventions that they made. Very important. Majd, good luck. It's really inspiring what you were able to do despite all the challenges in Gaza.
Thank you.
Going back to your question, Tanya, I think we really don't have too many options. You said Gaza is on a thin thread, but if we look at the numbers now, especially after COVID, unfortunately, I think even that thread is being closed. We're talking about an expected fall of 10% in the GDP. The perfect storm hitting Gaza, both COVID and the PA decision not to take the tax revenues, have resulted in quite significant impact in Gaza. I mean, the economic situation in Gaza was very bad to start with. Therefore, when people look at the numbers, they're like, okay, so another 5–10% fall, what does it mean? Well, that 5–10% fall means, for example, an increase in 10% in poverty and food insecurity for people. It also means that the increase in Qatari aid to Gaza, the quite significant increase in absolute numbers of Qatari aid in Gaza, if we assess its economic impact, well, all it means that it will only sustain the situation from collapsing. It will not result in any economic development or progress in Gaza, just because the decision by the PA not to pay full salaries or not to take the taxes that would enable it to pay public employee salaries means that about $30 million were already lost in Gaza. So if you take the extra money that Qatar is pumping into Gaza, which is very important, but nonetheless, once the PA is not transferring the salaries, the only thing that is happening is that the Qatari money is filling a new vacuum created by a political decision not to take the tax money. Now, if someone wants to shoot themselves in the head, and I'm speaking about the PA, the question is, should we, as the international community or as NGOs, stand on the side and continue to look at this person committing suicide? In this case, it's not a person, it's an authority responsible for 5 million people, both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And in the Gaza Strip, about more than 50% of all people employed who receive salaries are in the public sector. So the moment that the PA is not paying salaries, it's not paying pensions, that means about 50% of the people are not receiving money that they can then spend into the economy, which would create some movement inside the Gaza economy. It's such a fatal decision when it comes to the tax money. Now, obviously, the PA is arguing that they're doing it out of a political motivation. Someone might understand that, but on the other hand, this decision is resulting in such a tremendous impact, both on the West Bank economy and on the private sector in the West Bank, and the numbers there are staggering. I mean, If you look at the numbers in the West Bank this year, they resemble the numbers in Gaza. I mean, a 40% underutilization of labor. These are numbers that we used to see in Gaza, not in the West Bank. But in Gaza, it's way much worse. You're speaking about, for example, 65% of underutilization of labor in Gaza. We see an increase of 10% in poverty levels in Gaza, and this is only in counting Q1 and Q2. We still didn't get the numbers for Q3 and Q4, and I think the picture will be even worse. So therefore, I think we don't have the option to not to think about or think outside of the box on implementing projects that can help the private sector, because at the end of the day, if we can't help the public sector, we need to look at ways to help the private sector in Gaza. And to help the private sector in Gaza, it's not enough to focus on micro projects. We need to speak about big mega projects, a large industrial zone in the northern part of Gaza, in the southern part of Gaza, connected to infrastructure that would enable it to trade with the world, because at the end of the day, the Gaza economy, the Palestinian economy is small, and then the Gaza economy is even smaller, and smaller economies depend on trade with other countries. They depend on trading with the world. They are not economies of scale where internal economic activity is enough to sustain the economy. We're not talking about China or the US market. We're talking about Gaza. And Gaza depends on trade with the West Bank, with Israel, with other countries. And therefore, when we looked at trying to quantify the impact of measures, the only meaningful measure that would result in a change in Gaza is removing the restrictions on the entry of goods and raw materials in Gaza and allowing Gaza to export products and labor out from Gaza to Israel, to the West Bank, and to other countries. Now, for that to happen, obviously, there needs to be a set of political developments, favorable political developments that would allow that. Now, obviously, all of that is in theory. And in reality, we're facing a perfect storm. Because on the one hand, we have COVID, a pandemic that many countries are suffering from. And now, unfortunately, also in the most locked down place on planet Earth, Gaza, COVID is spreading. And the de facto government there is taking measures not too different from other authorities to deal with the situation, which is a lockdown. So you're talking about an area that is under lockdown, and inside that area, there's another lockdown. So how can the economy function in such a situation? It can't simply function. Neither trade with the outside world or internal trade inside Gaza. And now, on the other hand, you have the complications with the Palestinian Authority decision not to take the money, not to take the tax money, and the continuing threat of we are going to return the keys to Israel. So that begs the question, if the PA decides to return the keys to Israel, what's our plan as the international community to deal with even a more severe crisis in Gaza that will result from a decision to hand back the keys to Israel? How will Gaza be sustainable? Again, 85% of family income in Gaza depend on public salaries. As much as we would like to think that Gaza needs to be dependent on the private sector, it would take a long time until we get there. In the meantime, Gaza is very much dependent on the public sector. It's not good, but that's the reality. And if the PA decides to return the keys back to Israel, we'll need to find a way through the UN, through the AHLC, through other mechanisms to allow this public sector in Gaza to continue to function, because for now, in reality, it is sustaining what is left of the Gaza economy. And then we need to think about moving to building mega economic projects in order to sustain Gaza. One of the ideas we've published in one of our papers, establishing a North Gaza industrial zone in the Erez area, which would allow to link it through special mechanisms with the crossing there, allowing materials to come in and go out. And obviously, I can speak about that in more details, but I'm obviously cautious about time. So therefore, answering your question, Tanya, yes, we need to think outside the box. We need to think about mega projects, especially in the private sector. But at the same time, we need to remember that in reality now, what is left of the Gaza economy depends on aid, depends on the public sector continuing to function. And the last thing that anyone would like to see is a collapse of the PA that would result in a collapse in Gaza. Because that's the equation. The moment that the PA collapses, Gaza will collapse with it, because Gaza, more than the West Bank, is dependent on the money being transferred from the Palestinian Authority to Gaza. Despite the fact that over the years, these transfers have been corroded, despite the fact that over years, the PA has been cutting salaries in Gaza. But nonetheless, even now, with the little amounts of money that are being transferred from the Palestinian Authority to Gaza, these amounts are much more significant than, for example, the Qatari aid going into Gaza. So I'm not seeing many countries standing in line to fill in the gap once the PA collapses. Therefore, in the coming AHLC meeting, someone needs to beg and ask the question from the participants, what is the plan if at the end of the day the PA collapses? And we're not far from that situation or that point in time. The PA needs $300 million a month in order to continue its operation at a minimal level. If that money is not found, then it will not be able to pay salaries. It has been, in the last 4 months, for example, it paid only 1.5 salaries. 2.5 salaries are missing. These are 2.5 salaries missing from each family, but at the same time, it's hundreds of millions of dollars missing in the economy, which is basically choking the economy. The PA has exhausted the ability to lend money from private banks. It's now turned to the Arab League in order to lend money. The Arab League wouldn't even circulate the PA letter of request. So the PA is now turning to individual countries asking to receive loans on the expense of a guarantee of the money that is in Israel. So for God's sake, go take the money in Israel and then find other ways to challenge Israel. Not this way, because you're basically shooting yourself in the head and you're undermining the stability of the Palestinian economy and the stability of individuals and families, and you're eroding the ability of your people, of the Palestinian people, to continue in their struggle. We're seeing in the West Bank people who work for example, in the public sector and in the security forces, turning to work in Israel illegally. They cross the border, they go and work in Israel. So a policeman during the day now is going to work in Israel in construction. How smart is that? In Gaza, obviously, they don't have this luxury. They can't cross the border. You cross the border, you get shot, you get killed. So they don't even have the luxury to cross the border to go seek work in Israel. I think the first thing that needs to happen is the PA needs to climb down from the tree, take back the money. The AHLC needs to meet and needs to, not over Zoom, but they need to have a physical meeting where they have a serious discussion about the situation in the Palestinian territory and come up with a plan that includes the implementation of real economic projects in Gaza and in the West Bank that would help sustain the situation there. Thank you.
Thank you. You made yourself very clear and you answered most of the questions that I had. I am to kind of push back a bit. I agree with you that and the point of this call also is, of course, to look at the needs and rights of Palestinians, of residents of Gaza. I guess that there's an argument to be made between the short term, medium term, long term. I mean, if the PA does take the funds, and let's say there are projects that get off the ground, okay? So we're going to an imaginary place right now. But are there assurances that should be in place? You know, should the donor community be paying attention to, you know, the kinds of effects of these projects and measures? I mean, what are the assurances that need to be in place to make sure that we're not further isolating Gaza, that we're not further entrenching the political split?
I fail to understand how sustaining the economy in Gaza would undermine Palestinian unity. You know, the problem between Hamas and Fatah is a problem between Palestinian factions, two political Palestinian factions, and to be honest, they not necessarily are they representing their people. Not necessarily are they representing the Palestinian people. I don't think that there's a problem between Majd in Gaza and someone in Ramallah or myself as a Palestinian in Nazareth regarding our feeling as a one Palestinian people. So therefore, what would actually undermine our unity is the collapse of our societies, the collapse of the Palestinian society in the West Bank, the collapse of the Palestinian society in Gaza, and transforming us from being people who have dreams and who look for the future to people who are totally depressed, to people who would go and blow themselves up because they don't have a future. That's the work of politicians, unfortunately. We shouldn't fall into that trap. I think the trap of a further isolation between Gaza and the West Bank, no, it's not further isolation between the West Bank and Gaza. Trust me, Palestinians as a people are united. The ones in the US, the ones in Europe, the ones in Gaza, the ones in Nazareth, the ones in the West Bank, we are united as a people at the end of the day. Every one of us sees himself as a Palestinian. What we need to do now, and what the international community needs to help us as a people, is sustain our identity as Palestinians and sustain our dignity as Palestinians. Because the moment that we lose our dignity as human beings, who no longer have the ability to think of the future because of bad political decisions by, let me be very clear, outdated leadership, or people who have dreams about creating an imaginary situation. No, we need to focus on sustaining the people in Gaza, like Majd, helping people like Majd. Ultimately, Palestinians hopefully will be united, and one day we will have a state, hopefully. But in the meantime, we need to survive as human beings. We need to help our private sector sustain itself, because we can no longer continue to be dependent on aid coming from Qatar, or coming from the UAE, or coming from Saudi Arabia, or coming from the US or any other countries, because aid comes at a price, and aid comes at a political price. There is no free meals. If someone is giving you money, they're giving you money with conditions. What we need now is to focus on the private sector and to focus on building our viability to be able to sustain ourselves. And then later on, we will think about statehood, and later on, we will think about independence. But for now, we need to think about how do we preserve ourselves as people and the dignity of our people, because unfortunately, the dignity of our people is coming under attack. They're attacking us in different Arab countries, unfortunately, for the acts of our politicians, if it's in Fatah or in Hamas. And the Palestinians as a people, are paying the price for the mistakes of the politicians. But I think we need, if friends in the international community want to help the Palestinian people, They need to help the Palestinian people, not the politicians and the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you for that.